Well, as Moana famously sings, no one knows how far it goes, and that lyric refers to the ocean, but it might also describe Disney's seemingly endless ambition to remake its animated films into live action. And having mostly exhausted its sort of classic canon, Disney now sets its sights on Moana, a tale not even yet like a full decade old, but it's also a story that is arguably like the best of the modern Disney era. So is Moana another soulless and like unnecessary live action remake, or is its delightful story worth revisiting in a new way? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I'll say just right from the start that I remain pretty apathetic towards these live action remakes, but Moana is one of my, if not my favorite Disney film. So while I was not necessarily excited for this version, I was at least hopeful. And you know what? I liked it. I think this is a fun film. Obviously, the need for these live-action remakes at all remains a very open question, but to me, Moana represents sort of the best possible outcome, a faithful remake with an earnest heroine sort of worthy of her animated counterpart, and an adventure that I think will still entertain and inspire young viewers. Now, and I doubt many will feel sorry for them, but Disney is kind of in a no-win scenario here. If the remake sort of diverges from or reimagines the original, such as a Snow White or The Little Mermaid, then it's criticized for disrespecting the legacy of a cherished classic. But if it remains faithful to the original, as a Moana does, then it's criticized for redundancy and sort of bringing nothing new to the table. I think there's just sort of a widespread sentiment that these remakes simply have no reason to exist. But just personally, I think stories are meant to be retold. Even Disney's animated classics were themselves often retelling of existing fairy tales, and even just Moana's story herself is really just another iteration of Joseph Campbell's Universal Hero's journey. And so I think when sort of moving beyond just the comparison game with the animated original, I think it is possible to enjoy these retellings as just a new vantage point on an existing great story. And by that, I mean that I think in a vacuum where the original animated version just doesn't exist, and I think without just the general stink towards modern Disney or just Hollywood at large, I think Moana works as a perfectly watchable and enjoyable adventure. I think it succeeds in part because the original story is excellent, and this remake is essentially just a carbon copy of that story. There are some subtle differences just in the tone, but there are no major plot alterations or new songs or really meaningful additions or subtractions. In fact, this may be Disney's most one-to-one remake yet, as though Disney merely flipped a switch in the film settings to go from animation mode to live action mode. But to me, I think this remake superpower, and I think also what elevates it above some of the previous remakes, is that newcomer actress Catherine Lagaaya is really excellent as our new Moana. I think she perfectly captures sort of the original's feisty strength and just earnest enthusiasm. Some of Moana's sort of bubbly personality, I think, has understandably sort of been toned down, but Lagaaya is just as spunky and easy to root for. I think this may be the closest to an animated character come to life that Disney has achieved yet. And just as a character, I think Moana also remains a standout as a sort of modern young role model, as a brave and adventurous heroine ready to go save her people, rather than just a passive damsel waiting for a handsome prince to come rescue her with a kiss. And I actually saw this film with my two young nieces who are aged 7 and 4, and both, of course, sporting Moana dresses, and they both loved it and loved her as a character. So I think in that sense, mission accomplished. I should note too that I think the live action visuals do increase somewhat the intensity of some scenes, such as the storms or the monsters, but my 4-year-old niece handled it without any trouble. So I think kids who have watched the original should be fine here too. Moana very much carries the film, but Dwayne Johnson I think is also fine as Maui, sort of awful wig notwithstanding. I think Maui was essentially an animated rendering of Johnson, and he himself is almost a cartoonish figure in real life. So I think the live action transition is not quite as jarring as maybe expected. Notably too, and more so than the animated film, this film emphasizes emphasizes that like Maui is also a sort of like chosen one. I think giving his character journey a bit more weight and kind of making him more into like a co-hero than just a sidekick, which I personally appreciated. Now, a valid criticism against all of these sort of Disney remakes is that they never offer addition, only subtraction, and that is probably true here as well. I can't really think of anything that's done better here than in the original. And like on the other hand, some of the original sort of sense of whimsy is lost, I think, with some charm that is really only possible through kind of like playful animation with like oversized eyes and bright colors. To that end, like the vibrancy of the visuals is more muted at times here, such as sort of the lush greenery of Te Fiti, and like the Realm of Monsters sequence is unfortunately sort of stripped down, feeling much less sort of otherworldly and interesting, which is perhaps like the film's clearest showcase of just the limitations of live action. That being said, the visuals are certainly like different, but they are not like the clear downgrade as might be expected, which is maybe because almost everything beyond like the two human protagonists is still basically animated, just with a more sort of photorealistic aesthetic. The film still looks like a fairy tale rather than like a grounded and like realistic rendering. For example, Disney thankfully avoids sucking all the cute and like endearing charm out of the animal sidekicks. Flounder from the live-action Little Mermaid movie still haunts my dreams regularly. But hey, sort of the dim-witted chicken remains like a highlight of comic relief here. And there are just still plenty of moments of sort of visual beauty that captures a sense of like magic and wonder from the original. And like the animation style, especially during like Maui's You're Welcome song, is adapted perhaps more like literally than expected, which does sort of further blur the line between live action and animation. And maybe that blurred line sort of somewhat defeats the purpose of remaking this film at all. But to me, I think it also helps the remake maintain at least some of the soul of the original. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, as you would hope, not a whole lot. For language, as in the original, at one point Moana yells, "Son of a," only now, rather than kind of leave the sentence unfinished, Maui adds the word beach. And then there's also just several words like sucks or bupkis. For violence, beyond it's like the harmless, fun action, all the violence is implied and it happens off screen, including a character that drowns or a crab creature that claims she has ate his mother. Also, like Maui's backstory involves him being thrown into the water by his parents as a baby, although it's a moment that's only depicted as like a tattoo on his back. For sexuality, nothing in this film for that. The only other kind of content stuff is there is quite a bit of sort of Polynesian-inspired spirituality and like mythology, as there was in the original, with plenty of like gods and goddesses and demigods. Maui is sort of largely credited for acts of creation, such as creating islands for humans, and the goddess Te Fiti is attributed with creating life. Also, when one character dies, they later return in the form of both a ghost and like an animal spirit. And you do have one moment where Maui comments that humans have done a poor job worshipping me. As far as the themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, this story really revolves around just a quest for identity. Moana feels defined by sort of societal expectations and just struggles to balance like her responsibilities to her family and her people with her like yearning for the sea. Similarly, Maui feels defined by just popular opinion and just his magical hook. And even Moana's family and tribe have really lost their identity as sea voyagers. And just like symbolically, like each of the characters begin on islands and like are confronted with the barriers of the ocean and must break through these restrictions to find their true identity and purpose, which culminates in what I think is some very like powerful visuals during the climactic scene in which Moana and Te Fiti both walk like directly through the parted water, like Moses and the Red Sea, kind of having both finally come to peace with their identities. Throughout the film, Moana frequently repeats her name and her quest, but really only at the end of the story is finally able to sing with conviction, "I am Moana." And I think like that song itself also includes the lyrics sung by Moana's grandmother, which say, "The people you love will change you, the things you have learned will guide you, and nothing on earth can silence the quiet voice still inside you." Now, that song is titled Song of the Ancestors, so like the full religious connotations is not perfectly compatible with Christianity, but I think the general truth is a wholesome and agreeable one, that we are defined by our family, by our life experiences, and by a sense of spiritual calling. So I think in a film about sort of so-called wayfinders using the stars stars to navigate the oceans, these three guiding principles are worthy of guiding our course. So, in the end, Moana may not win over anyone just determined to resist Disney's whole remake project just on principle, but I personally enjoyed it. I think Disney may be driven by just corporate greed to remake these animated classics, but it just seems to me that there's nothing about the remake itself that feels careless or phoned in. Moana may show a bit too much reverence and respect for the animated original, but I think it beats the alternative, as with something like Snow White that just seemed to have contempt for its source material. Adults can debate the merits of remaking a 10 years old film. I think that's totally fair, but the movie's success may be better judged on whether it still inspires young viewers to want to go become a wayfinder and brave the dangerous oceans beyond the reef to save the world from evil. So live action Moana may not be better, but I think it does remain a good story, and I just think good stories are always worth retelling. But hey, I would love to hear what you think if you're just totally done with these live action remakes, or maybe like me, you're still able to find at least a little bit of enjoyment in them. So don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation on it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.